The mistake that changed everything. The morning sun slipped quietly through the half-open blinds of a small downtown apartment, painting soft golden stripes across the cluttered desk where sketches, color palettes, and half-finished design drafts lay scattered like fragments of a restless mind. Emma Torres rubbed her eyes as she sat at the edge of her bed, her reflection in the mirror revealing the exhaustion that coffee could no longer hide. Her dark brown hair was loosely tied, a few strands falling across her face, and the pale tint of her skin made her look more fragile than she would ever admit. For weeks she had been pushing herself, long nights filled with deadlines, early mornings spent chasing clients who paid late, a life that always demanded more of her than it gave back. But recently even coffee wasn't enough. Her hands trembled slightly. Her body felt heavier each day, and the fatigue refused to let her go. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and she could feel it in her bones. The thought of seeing a doctor had scared her at first. Healthcare wasn't cheap, and freelance work didn't come with insurance. Still, when she nearly fainted during a presentation at a client's office, she knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. That was how Emma found herself sitting in the waiting room of Riverside Medical Center, a building that smelled faintly of antiseptic and ambition. The lower floors were crowded with ordinary people, single mothers juggling toddlers, old men coughing into handkerchiefs, construction workers in dusty uniforms. But the upper floors, as Emma noticed, had frosted glass walls and private elevators with keycard access. It was a hospital that served both worlds, the struggling and the powerful, yet kept them neatly apart. Emma clutched the form the receptionist had given her and filled it out carefully, checking boxes that asked too many questions about her body, her habits, her past. She wrote routine checkup under the reason for visit, because that was all it was supposed to be. Routine, nothing life-changing. She had no idea that the few strokes of her pen that morning would mark the beginning of a story that would shake both her world and someone else's to the core. At the very same moment, across the city in a glass tower that touched the clouds, Alexander Grant adjusted his cufflinks before the mirror in his penthouse suite. He was 38, the founder of a billion-dollar tech empire, a man whose name appeared in magazines under headlines like "The Visionary CEO Reshaping the Future." Yet behind the image of success was a man hollowed out by loneliness and pressure. Years of late nights, boardroom battles, and soulless relationships had carved deep lines of weariness around his eyes. He had the money, the cars, the acclaim, everything the world envied. And yet every morning as he looked out at the skyline, he felt a gnawing emptiness. His personal doctor had been insisting for months that he do a fertility preservation procedure, as the physician politely called it. "You're not getting any younger, Mr. Grant," the doctor had said. "It's a simple precaution for the future." Alexander had finally agreed, not out of desire for fatherhood, but from habit, the habit of control, of planning every contingency. That morning, he too headed to Riverside Medical Center. Only he used the private elevator, the one that skipped the crowded floors entirely. The clinic suite that greeted him was elegant, sterile, and silent, with white leather chairs and glass partitions that gleamed under soft lights. The nurse spoke to him in measured tones, offering privacy forms and consent documents. Alexander signed them quickly, hardly reading. He was used to paperwork, to legal jargon, to trusting that expensive services equaled perfection. He didn't know that perfection, even in a hospital that charged thousands for discretion, was still built on human hands, and humans made mistakes. Downstairs, Emma was led to a small exam room by a tired nurse who smelled faintly of soap and peppermint. The woman's name tag read Nurse Rita, and her voice was kind, almost motherly, as she took Emma's vitals and asked about her symptoms. "You just need a few tests, dear," she said. "Probably nothing serious. Wait here, and someone from the lab will come to collect samples." Emma nodded, trying to relax on the cold table. The paper beneath her crinkled with every breath. She didn't notice the fatigue in the nurse's eyes or the way the younger technician who entered next, Zoe, her badge read, looked distracted and overwhelmed. Zoe was new, covering a double shift because 2 others had called in sick. She had a stack of charts in her hands, room numbers written hastily in pencil, and her mind buzzed with exhaustion. Somewhere between those pages, 2 files, room 12B Grant Alexander and room 12A Torres Emma, got mixed. Zoe should have checked the system. She should have confirmed the ID numbers, but fatigue dulls attention and pressure kills caution. The procedure that followed took less than 15 minutes. Emma didn't understand half of it. Some injection, some equipment she hadn't seen before. When she asked, "I thought this was just a blood test?" Zoe muttered something about updated protocols and kept going. Emma lay back, confused but compliant, assuming it was part of the routine. It wasn't. It was an insemination procedure, one meant for a completely different patient. 3 floors above, Dr. Hammond, the clinic director, was shaking Alexander's hand, assuring him that the procedure had gone smoothly. "Everything's been processed and safely stored," he said. "You'll receive confirmation shortly." Alexander nodded, distracted, already thinking about the meeting waiting at his office. To him, the appointment was over. He didn't know that his genetic sample had gone exactly where it was never meant to. That night, the city lights glittered across the river as Emma took the bus home, her body aching and her mind heavy with fatigue. She heated leftover noodles, opened her laptop, and worked late into the night, unaware that something inside her had already begun to change. Life carried on. The same deadlines, the same phone calls, the same quiet loneliness. Until weeks later, her morning coffee made her nauseous. The smell of perfume turned her stomach. She missed her period, then another. Denial can be powerful, but fear is louder. When she finally bought a pregnancy test, her hands shook so badly, she dropped the box twice before tearing it open. 2 pink lines. Clear, undeniable, impossible. She sat on the bathroom floor for a long time, unable to breathe, staring at the result as if the plastic stick itself had betrayed her. There was no boyfriend, no partner. She hadn't been with anyone in nearly a year. How could this happen? The phone call came the next morning. A calm but trembling voice asked, "Ms. Torres? This is Dr. Hammond from Riverside Medical Center. We need you to come in immediately. There's been an error." Emma's world narrowed to that single word, error. She sat frozen long after the line went dead, heart pounding until she found herself back on that same bus, staring out at the passing buildings like a ghost of herself. When she entered the clinic, the receptionist avoided her eyes. Dr. Hammond was waiting in his office with a lawyer seated beside him, both men wearing the kind of expressions reserved for tragedies that can't be undone. "There was a mix-up," he began carefully. "During your last visit, you were given a procedure you did not consent to." Emma's pulse quickened. "What kind of procedure?" The silence stretched until the lawyer cleared his throat. "An insemination," he said softly. "You're pregnant, Ms. Torres, and the biological father is Mr. Alexander Grant." The name hit her like lightning. Everyone knew Alexander Grant. The tech mogul, the billionaire who never smiled, the man whose face appeared on billboards downtown. Emma laughed once, a sharp, broken sound. "That's ridiculous," she said. "That's impossible." But as the reality sank in, tears filled her eyes. Not soft tears of sadness, but the wild, shaking kind that come when life splits in 2 directions at once. She stood up, her legs barely steady, and stumbled out of the room, ignoring their voices calling after her. On the street outside, the wind felt cold and sharp. She clutched her bag to her chest and walked without knowing where she was going, her vision blurring until she couldn't tell if it was the city lights or her own tears. That evening, when she finally made it home, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "This is Alexander Grant. I've been informed about what happened. We need to talk." Emma stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. A stranger's name, a stranger's child, a mistake that had rewritten her entire existence. She didn't reply at first. She sat by the window for hours, the city sprawling below, the hum of traffic like distant waves. Her reflection stared back from the glass, a woman who had lost control of her own story. But as the night deepened, something hardened inside her. She had done nothing wrong. She had been violated by negligence, not by choice. And whoever this man was, billionaire or not, he would have to face her. Finally, she typed 2 words that would set their fates in motion. Where and when? The billionaire's proposal. The next morning dawned gray and restless, the kind of day when clouds hung low over the skyline, and the air felt thick with unspoken tension. Emma hadn't slept. Her mind had spent the night racing in circles, replaying the phone call from Dr. Hammond, the stunned faces in that sterile office, and the single message that still glowed on her phone screen. "This is Alexander Grant. We need to talk." She had typed back, "Where and when?" 2 words that felt like a leap into a world she didn't belong to. Now, as she stood in front of her closet trying to decide what to wear, her hands trembled slightly. Nothing she owned felt right. Every outfit seemed either too plain or too defensive, like armor she didn't know how to use. Eventually, she settled on a navy blue dress, simple, modest, but strong, and tied her hair into a loose bun. Her stomach churned with nerves and something deeper, something that felt like grief for the life that had ended the moment she walked into that clinic weeks ago. At exactly 1:30, a black sedan appeared outside her apartment building. The driver stepped out, an older man in a tailored suit who addressed her with quiet respect. "Miss Torres, Mr. Grant has sent me to escort you." His tone was professional, neither cold nor warm, and that somehow unsettled her more. The city blurred past the car window as they drove through the financial district, a place Emma usually avoided because it reminded her of everything she didn't have: power, security, control. Glass towers loomed above, reflecting the sky like mirrors that only showed perfection. Somewhere up there, she thought, sat the man whose life was now tangled with hers in a way neither of them had chosen. When the car pulled into an underground garage beneath a skyscraper marked Grant Innovations, Emma's breath caught. The air smelled faintly of metal and money. The driver led her to a private elevator that rose so silently she couldn't tell they were moving until the doors opened onto a space that took her breath away. The office wasn't an office at all. It was a cathedral of glass and light. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the skyline, and minimalist furniture gleamed under soft illumination. A woman in a sleek suit approached with a practiced smile. "Miss Torres, welcome. Mr. Grant is expecting you." Emma followed her across polished marble floors until they reached a large window where a tall man stood with his back to her, gazing out over the city. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. Broad shoulders, tailored suit, dark hair touched with silver near the temples. When he turned, she felt a flicker of recognition, not of his face but of his presence. Authority radiated from him, the kind that came from years of being obeyed. But there was something else too. A weariness behind his sharp eyes, as if power itself had become a cage. "Ms. Torres," he said, his voice calm but deep, a voice that could fill boardrooms and command silence. "Thank you for coming." Emma's pulse quickened. "Did I have a choice?" she asked quietly. For a second, something flickered across his face, and surprise, then a hint of guilt. "No," he admitted softly. "I suppose you didn't." He gestured toward the sitting area. Two leather chairs faced each other across a low glass table. She sat clutching her purse, while he remained standing for a moment, hands in his pockets, studying her like he was trying to understand the shape of this disaster. "I've spent the last 48 hours trying to make sense of what happened," he began. "The hospital informed me it's—" He hesitated, searching for a word that didn't exist. Beyond comprehension. Emma looked at him steadily. "You mean it's a scandal?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "No," he said. "It's a tragedy. For both of us." The sincerity in his tone startled her. She had expected arrogance, denial, perhaps an attempt to buy silence. Instead, his voice carried a weight that felt almost human. "I don't know what they told you," Emma said, her voice tight. "But I never consented to any of this. I came in for a simple checkup. That's all. And now I'm—" She stopped, her throat closing. "Now I'm pregnant." Alexander sat down across from her, his posture composed but his hands tense. "I know," he said quietly. "And I don't expect forgiveness, not from you, not from anyone. But I need you to understand that this wasn't something I would ever choose. Not like this. You're the victim of their negligence, as am I. But there's a child now. Our child." The word hung in the air between them, heavy, fragile, terrifying. Emma flinched. "Don't call it that," she said sharply. "I don't even know you." He nodded, accepting the rebuke. "You're right. You don't. But that doesn't change what's already happened. I intend to take responsibility, Auntie, fully." She laughed bitterly. "Of course you do. Men like you always think responsibility means money." He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about being present. About doing what's right, even when it's impossible." Emma looked at him for a long moment, searching for the lie, but found only exhaustion in his eyes, the same kind she saw in herself when she worked through the night. "And what exactly do you think is right here?" she asked. He hesitated, then said carefully, "I want to help you through the pregnancy. I want to make sure you have everything you need. Medical care, support, safety, and I'd like to be involved if you'll allow it." Her pulse thundered in her ears. You want to be involved? She repeated. With me, with a stranger? With a child that shouldn't even exist? Yes, he said simply. Because it does exist. Because it's innocent. The conviction in his tone made her chest tighten. She wanted to hate him, to see him as the enemy. But something in his calm steadiness disarmed her. Still, she wasn't ready to let her guard down. I don't need your charity, she said, rising to her feet. It's not charity, he replied softly. It's responsibility. And maybe redemption. She froze. That word, redemption, felt like a crack in his armor. You think helping me will redeem you? I think it might redeem something, he said quietly. The silence that followed was long and strange. The city outside shimmered in the afternoon haze, skyscrapers like silver blades piercing the clouds. Finally, Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I had my lawyers draft something. Not a contract, he added quickly, seeing her expression. A proposal. Terms that protect your rights, your independence, and your safety. You don't have to agree to anything now, just read it. Emma took the envelope but didn't open it. What kind of proposal? Move into my residence during the pregnancy, he said. You'll have your own quarters, complete privacy, a workspace for your design career. It's about stability, not control. I want to make sure you and the baby are safe. Nothing more. She stared at him in disbelief. You want me to live with you? He nodded, temporarily, until the baby's born. I'll provide security, medical care, and anything you need. No conditions, no obligations. She shook her head, stunned. This is insane. We're strangers. Yes, he said, his voice low. But we're strangers bound by something we can't undo. For a moment, neither spoke. Emma looked down at the envelope again, her heart pounding. The offer sounded insane, and yet in a small, terrifying way it also sounded like safety. Her freelance income barely covered rent. The pregnancy was already draining her, and beneath her anger there was fear. Fear of doing this alone. I'll think about it, she said finally. That's all I ask, he replied. When she left the building, her head was spinning. The driver held the car door open, but Emma didn't get in right away. She looked up at the glass tower towering above her, at the name Grant Innovations carved into steel. Somewhere up there was the man who had turned her life into a storm. Somewhere in her, another life was growing. One she hadn't chosen but could no longer deny. That night, back in her apartment, she finally opened the envelope. The papers inside were detailed but surprisingly considerate. Separate living quarters, full autonomy, her right to leave any time, her work protected, a monthly stipend that would cover more than her needs. And at the bottom, handwritten in neat ink, were words that made her throat tighten. You are not alone in this. Whatever you decide, I will respect it. Agi, for the first time in weeks, she cried. Not from anger, but from the unbearable weight of being seen. Days passed. She didn't answer his calls right away. She tried to focus on her projects, but her mind kept circling back to that envelope, to that message, to his eyes. Steady, haunted, real. Finally, one evening, as rain streaked the windows, she sent a short message. Okay, but there will be rules. The reply came almost instantly. Whatever you need. 2 weeks later, Emma stood in the lobby of Alexander Grant's penthouse building, her suitcases beside her heart thudding like a drum. The doorman greeted her politely. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a world so far from her own that it might as well have been another planet. When she stepped inside the penthouse, Alexander was waiting, not in a suit this time, but in a simple white shirt with rolled sleeves. For the first time, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man trying to make something right. Welcome, he said quietly. Your space is ready. Her space turned out to be an entire suite. Soft neutral tones, sunlight spilling through tall windows, a studio area for her design work, and a private balcony overlooking the city. It was beautiful, too beautiful, almost frightening. She turned to him, unsure what to say. It's more than I expected, she admitted. He smiled faintly. After what you've been through, it's the least I could do. That night, as she unpacked her things in silence, Emma looked around at the space that wasn't home but felt safer than anywhere she'd been in months. For the first time since the nightmare began, she exhaled without trembling. And yet as she lay in bed, her thoughts drifted to the man down the hall, the stranger whose life had collided with hers through a single human mistake. She didn't trust him, not yet. But for reasons she couldn't explain, she no longer feared him either. Outside, the city hummed, and somewhere in that vastness, a story neither of them had chosen was beginning to take shape. A story that would test them both, break them open, and maybe, just maybe, teach them what love really meant. The heartbeat morning light poured through the wide glass windows of Alexander Grant's penthouse, turning the marble floors to gold and catching faint motes of dust that floated like tiny stars in the air. The city stretched far below, its pulse steady and distant, but inside the quiet apartment there was only the soft sound of running water and the gentle clink of dishes. Emma stood barefoot in the kitchen, wearing one of her loose cotton dresses, her dark hair tied back and her eyes still heavy with sleep. She had been living there for 3 weeks now, and though the space was nothing like the small, noisy apartment she had left behind, the silence had slowly begun to feel less intimidating. She poured herself a cup of tea and glanced toward the hallway, where the faint sound of typing drifted from Alexander's office. He was always working, even on weekends, his attention tethered to the glow of his computer screen and the endless stream of messages that demanded his focus. Yet in the short time they had shared this strange coexistence, Emma had begun to notice the cracks beneath his controlled exterior. Sometimes late at night, she would hear footsteps pacing the living room or see the light from his office spilling beneath the door until dawn. Once she caught a glimpse of him standing alone on the balcony, a glass of water in his hand, staring out into the city like a man lost inside his own success. Their interactions were cautious but polite. They shared breakfast where conversation hovered between the impersonal and the necessary, updates from her doctor, suggestions about diet, subtle reassurances that neither wanted to admit were needed. Emma worked from the studio space he had built for her, designing logos and product concepts for clients who didn't know her world had turned upside down. The room had tall shelves, bright natural light, and a small corner where she kept her sketchbooks, each one filled with drawings of things she didn't quite understand. Hands reaching for one another, tiny shapes that looked like wings, patterns that felt both fragile and powerful. Alexander, true to his word, had respected every boundary. He kept his distance, never prying, never overstepping, but his presence lingered. In the way the household staff spoke about him with quiet respect, in the gentle notes he sometimes left near the breakfast tray, "Remember your supplements," or "Appointment at 10 wire, driver, ready at 9:15, and in the subtle sense of care that lived in every corner of the home. Still, there were moments when Emma's anger returned like an old wound. When she caught sight of his company logo on a television ad, she would think if it weren't for him, none of this would have happened. But then she would remember the look in his eyes when he first said, "I want this child." It hadn't been arrogance. It had been something closer to fear, the kind of fear that comes when someone realizes they've been given a second chance they never asked for. Her next appointment was scheduled for Friday morning. It would be her first ultrasound, the first time she would see, not just imagine, the life growing inside her. She hadn't expected Alexander to care enough to attend, but when she mentioned it at breakfast, he looked up immediately from his tablet. "I'll come with you," he said simply. She hesitated. "You don't have to." "I know," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. "But I want to." That morning, the car ride to the clinic was silent except for the hum of the engine. Emma watched the buildings pass by, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her sleeve. Alexander sat beside her, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. When they arrived, the nurse greeted them both with polite professionalism, though Emma could sense the faint ripple of curiosity in her eyes. The billionaire and the woman no one had ever seen before, walking side by side into the obstetrics wing. Inside the dim examination room, Emma lay on the padded table, her hands resting on her stomach. The doctor moved the wand across her abdomen, the cool gel making her shiver slightly. Then the monitor flickered to life, and for a moment the room was filled with the rhythmic sound of something miraculous. A heartbeat, rapid and strong, echoing through the speakers like the pulse of the universe itself. Emma gasped. Her eyes widened as she stared at the tiny, flickering image on the screen, a small form, no bigger than a seed, but undeniably alive. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "That's our baby," she whispered, her voice trembling. The doctor smiled softly. "That's your baby's heartbeat." She turned her head and her gaze met Alexander's. He was standing at her side, his expression completely unguarded for the first time since she'd met him. His usually composed face had softened, and his eyes glistened with emotion. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand, gently, hesitantly, as if asking permission to share the moment. Emma didn't pull away. She couldn't. The sound filled her entire chest, pushing away every doubt, every anger, every fear. The mistake that had started all of this had somehow created something so pure that it silenced everything else. When the appointment ended, they walked back to the car in silence. The air outside smelled faintly of rain, and the world seemed quieter than before. Halfway through the drive, Alexander spoke, his voice low. "I've built everything in my life on logic," he said. "On numbers, systems, predictions. But hearing that heartbeat..." He paused, searching for the right words. "It's the first time in years I've felt something real. Something that isn't about profit or control." Emma turned to him, unsure what to say. "That heartbeat belongs to a life neither of us planned," she murmured. He nodded slowly. "Maybe the best things aren't planned." They didn't speak again for the rest of the ride, but something unspoken had shifted between them. The air that once felt heavy with awkwardness now carried a strange, fragile warmth. Over the following weeks, their daily rhythm began to change. Alexander started coming home earlier, sometimes appearing in the kitchen while she cooked, offering to help despite not knowing the first thing about frying an egg. Once, he burned the omelet so badly that the smoke alarm went off, and Emma laughed harder than she had in months. The sound startled him, but then he smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that made him look 10 years younger. They began to share dinners more often, their conversations stretching beyond medical updates and business schedules. Emma learned that Alexander had grown up in a small town, raised by a single mother who had worked 2 jobs to send him to college. He learned that Emma had once dreamed of becoming an artist before life's practicality pushed her into graphic design. They found comfort in those small revelations. 2 people from different worlds discovering they weren't as different as they'd believed. Yet even as connection bloomed, guilt lingered between them. One evening, while watching the sunset from the balcony, Emma spoke softly. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if the clinic hadn't made that mistake?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Every day, and..." He turned to her, his eyes shadowed by the fading light. "Then I realized that wondering doesn't change anything. What matters now is how we handle what did happen." She looked away, her hand instinctively brushing her stomach. "It's just strange. I'm starting to care about something I never chose," he nodded. "So am I." That night, after she went to bed, Alexander stood alone in the living room, staring at the city lights below. The thought had haunted him for weeks. How a single error, one human mistake, had forced him to confront everything he'd been avoiding. The loneliness, the emptiness, the fear of what his life meant beyond numbers and headlines. But now, for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that wasn't about ambition. Meanwhile, in her room, Emma lay awake, one hand resting on her belly. The sound of that heartbeat echoed in her mind, soft and steady, a reminder that something extraordinary had taken root inside her. She wasn't ready to forgive the past or surrender her independence, but she couldn't deny the small, growing bond between her and the man down the hall. A bond built not on romance or convenience, but on shared responsibility and something deeper she couldn't yet name. Days turned into weeks and the pregnancy advanced steadily. Emma's nausea faded, replaced by the first flutters of movement beneath her ribs, faint kicks that made her smile when no one was looking. Alexander began joining her for walks around the rooftop garden, always keeping a respectful distance but matching her pace, listening quietly when she spoke. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they argued, sometimes they simply existed in silence that felt oddly comfortable. The staff noticed the change too. The penthouse, once cold and sterile, now seemed alive. The kitchen smelled of fresh food. Laughter occasionally drifted from the dining area. Even the security guards exchanged knowing glances, sensing something soft and unspoken taking shape behind those glass walls. But life, like the city below, was unpredictable. One evening, as thunder rolled over the skyline, Emma received a call from her lawyer, the one Dr. Hammond's clinic had recommended for settlements. The hospital was offering compensation for their Unfortunate procedural error. The number was staggering, enough to erase her debts, buy a home, secure her future. But accepting it would mean signing a non-disclosure agreement, promising never to speak publicly about what had happened. Emma hung up and stared at the contract in disbelief. Money could fix everything, at least on paper, but it couldn't erase what had been done to her. And she knew that whatever decision she made, it would affect not just her but the child, and Alexander too. Later that night, she found him in his office, still awake, papers spread across his desk. "They offered me a settlement," she said quietly. He looked up sharply. "How much?" she told him. His jaw tightened. "That's not justice," he said. "That's silence, I know," she whispered. "But it's also freedom. Security." He stood and walked to the window, his reflection merging with the city lights. "They took something from you that money can't replace. Don't let them buy your silence," she hesitated. "You sound like someone who knows what it's like to be silenced." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I do." For a long moment they stood there, two silhouettes against the glass, their reflections overlapping like threads of a story neither had chosen, but both were beginning to own. In that moment, Emma realized something had changed irrevocably. The man she had once seen as a symbol of everything unfair in the world was no longer a stranger. He was flawed, complicated, human, and slowly, impossibly, becoming a part of her life, and deep within her, the tiny heartbeat that had once sounded so distant now felt like a bridge between two broken people who were learning, one quiet day at a time, that love sometimes begins not with choice, but with accident. The storm within the city lay under a restless sky that evening, its horizon bruised by clouds heavy with unspent rain. Inside the penthouse, warm light glowed against the glass walls. But even the luxury and comfort could not disguise the tension that had begun to coil through the rooms like invisible smoke. Emma sat by the window, a sketch pad resting on her knees, though the pencil in her hand had stopped moving long ago. Her thoughts were somewhere far away, tangled in questions she couldn't silence, fears she couldn't name, and emotions she didn't dare acknowledge. It had been nearly 5 months since that fateful day in the clinic. 5 months since her life had been rewritten by mistake and fate. The child inside her was growing strong, the gentle curve of her stomach visible now even beneath loose clothing, and each soft kick reminded her that time was moving forward whether she was ready or not. In the early days, things between her and Alexander had been awkward but respectful, bound by formality and fragile trust. But lately that boundary had started to blur. He had become gentler, less like the distant billionaire who once lived behind walls of glass and precision, and more like a man who was learning, awkwardly but sincerely, how to care. He had attended every appointment, read every report, asked questions about vitamins and sleep patterns, and even accompanied her on walks through the city park, disguised under a baseball cap to avoid attention. Sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught him staring at her. Not in the way men look at women, but in the way someone watches something precious and fragile, something they can't believe they're allowed to witness, and yet, something unspoken was building between them. Emma could feel it in the pauses that lingered too long, in the way his voice softened when he said her name, in the way her heart reacted when his hand brushed hers accidentally. But there was also guilt, heavy, stubborn guilt, because their connection was born from violation and error. Could anything real come from something so wrong? The illusion of calm shattered one afternoon when Alexander's assistant Grace arrived at the penthouse looking pale and uneasy. She carried a folded newspaper in one hand, and Emma knew immediately, from the way Alexander's jaw tightened, that something was wrong. Grace hesitated before speaking. "It's out," she said softly, setting the paper on the table. Someone leaked the story. The headline seemed to scream from the page. Tech billionaire's genetic sample used in medical scandal. Woman pregnant after clinic mix-up. Emma felt the blood drain from her face as the words blurred in front of her eyes. There was her name, partially obscured for privacy but recognizable enough to anyone who knew her. There was the hospital's name. There was his, and underneath it all a storm of speculation, judgment, and sensationalism that stripped away their humanity and turned them into headlines. "I'm so sorry," Grace whispered before retreating, leaving the paper between them like a wound. Alexander picked it up, his hand steady but his voice low and cold. They promised confidentiality, he said. They swore this would stay sealed. Emma could barely breathe. Everyone's going to know, she murmured, her voice trembling. My family. My clients. She pressed a hand to her stomach as if trying to protect the child from invisible eyes. They'll think whatever sells papers. Alexander cut in bitterly, then immediately softened his tone. Emma, I'll handle it. My legal team will— This isn't just about your image, she interrupted, her voice breaking. This is my life, my body, my name. You can fix your reputation, but what about me? What about my privacy? The pain in her words hit him like a blow. For a moment, the mask of composure cracked. You're right, he said quietly. I should have done more to protect you. I should have anticipated this. Anticipated? Emma laughed, the sound sharp and full of disbelief. You can't anticipate this, Alexander. You can't control everything. He stepped closer, his voice steady but strained. I can try to make it right. Her eyes met his, fierce and wet. You can't fix what was never supposed to happen. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Outside, thunder rumbled like a distant warning. Emma turned away, unable to look at him, and whispered, I need space. Without another word, she walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the long hallway. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft chime, leaving Alexander standing alone amidst the quiet hum of the city. The newspaper crumpled in his hand. Emma didn't go far, just to the small studio she had rented downtown months before, a place that still smelled faintly of paint and old dreams. She needed air, distance, something that belonged to her alone. The noise of the city was oddly comforting after the suffocating perfection of the penthouse. She sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the skyline where Alexander's tower rose like a ghost from another world. She felt anger, confusion, sadness, and beneath it all, something that terrified her more than anything else. She missed him. Over the next few days, the media frenzy grew. Journalists camped outside the clinic. Online articles multiplied by the hour, filled with speculation about lawsuits, money, morality. Emma's inbox flooded with messages, some sympathetic, many cruel. Strangers debated her life as if it were fiction, and through it all, Alexander's lawyers sent statements trying to shield her, to redirect the story toward the hospital's negligence. But the internet had no mercy. Late one night, after hours of scrolling through comments she shouldn't have read, Emma's phone buzzed. A message from Alexander. Are you safe? She stared at it for a long time, her eyes burning before replying, I don't know anymore. The typing dots appeared, disappeared, then came back. Please let me see you. Not to talk about damage control, just to make sure you're okay. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen before finally typing. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. at the park. The next morning was cold and gray, the kind of morning that carried the scent of rain before the first drop fell. Emma sat on a bench in the quiet corner of the park, her hands clasped in her lap, eyes fixed on the pond where ducks drifted lazily across the water. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, steady, familiar. He looked tired, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his eyes shadowed. For once, he wasn't dressed like a CEO. He wore a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, and somehow that made him look more human than ever. You look pale, he said softly, sitting down beside her but not too close. I haven't been sleeping, she admitted. It's strange being famous for the wrong reasons. He nodded, guilt flickering across his face. I wish I could take that from you. She looked at him then, really looked. You can't take it. You can only face it with me, but if you keep trying to control everything, you'll destroy us both. His gaze dropped to her hands folded tightly over her belly. When this all started, I thought I could fix it, like a problem to be solved. But now, he paused, his voice trembling slightly. Now I don't want to fix it. I just want to be part of it, of you, of this. The honesty in his words disarmed her completely. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire who built empires, but the man who had been quietly dismantling his own defenses since the day they met. Tears welled in her eyes. You don't even know what this means yet, Alexander. You think you want this, but what if it's just guilt, or the illusion of redemption? He shook his head slowly. Maybe it started as guilt, but every time I see you, every time I hear that heartbeat, it feels like something more, something real. The wind rustled the trees around them, scattering a few early leaves across the grass. Emma's throat tightened. Real or not, this isn't easy. I'm still scared. Every day, I'm scared too, he said. But for once, I don't want to run from it. They sat there for a long while, the silence between them no longer sharp but heavy with understanding. When the first drops of rain began to fall, Alexander took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders without a word. She didn't protest. She simply leaned back against the bench, eyes closed, letting the sound of rain mix with the faint echo of memory. The sound of that tiny heartbeat that had changed everything. That evening, back in her small studio, Emma opened her sketchbook again. Her hands moved almost on their own, sketching the outline of a tiny figure surrounded by swirling shapes. A heart, a city, a storm. When she finished, she stared at the drawing for a long time, then smiled faintly. The storm wasn't over, not by a long shot, but maybe, just maybe, she was learning to stand in the rain. And somewhere across the city, Alexander stood on his balcony, phone in hand, rereading her last message, just 3 words she had sent before midnight. I'm still here. He looked up at the sky, where thunder rolled like distant applause, and, for the first time in years, he felt something stronger than fear. Hope. The choice of the heart. The winter morning unfolded softly over the city, its skyline washed in a pale silver hue. Snow dusted the rooftops like powdered sugar, and the streets below shimmered under the faint touch of dawn. Inside the hospital, the air carried the crisp scent of antiseptic and quiet urgency. A thin fog of breath hovered in the waiting area where Alexander Grant sat alone, elbows on his knees, head bowed between clasped hands. His expensive coat lay forgotten on the chair beside him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about quarterly results, mergers, or shareholders. Every thought in his mind revolved around one person, the woman in the delivery room down the hall, and the life she was bringing into the world. The past few months had been a storm of contradictions. The scandal had never entirely died down, though it had begun to fade from headlines. Public curiosity had moved on, as it always did, and the hospital had faced its reckoning through lawsuits and investigations. Emma, however, had chosen not to disappear into bitterness. She had done something far harder. She had chosen to live. When the press chased her, she stood before them with her head high, speaking softly but firmly. I am not a victim, she had said, her voice steady before the cameras. I am a mother. The simplicity of her words had disarmed everyone. She refused to sell her story, refused the sensational offers, and with each quiet act of dignity, she had rewritten her narrative from scandal to strength. Alexander had stood beside her that day, not as a savior or a CEO, but as a man learning to earn his place in her life one moment at a time. He had learned to listen more than he spoke, to care without control, and to let go of the idea that money could repair everything. What began as guilt had turned into something deeper, something neither of them had expected, a connection woven through shared vulnerability, trust, and a kind of love that was never declared but always present. Now, as the muted hum of hospital corridors surrounded him, that connection pulsed through him like a second heartbeat. He could still hear Emma's voice before they took her inside, calm but laced with pain, her hand gripping his. Don't panic, she had whispered with a wry smile, sweat glistening on her forehead. You can face boardrooms full of billionaires. You can handle this too. He had laughed then, but now, waiting alone, every second stretched into an eternity. When the door finally opened, the nurse's smile told him everything before she even spoke. Congratulations, Mr. Grant, you have a healthy baby boy. The world seemed to stop for a heartbeat, then flood back into motion. He followed the nurse down the corridor, every step feeling unreal. When he entered the room, time folded into silence. Emma lay against white sheets, her hair damp, her face pale but radiant. In her arms, wrapped in a small blue blanket, was the child who had turned both their worlds upside down. She looked up, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but glowing with something indescribable. Meet your son, she whispered. Alexander approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. When Emma lifted the tiny bundle toward him, his hands trembled as he took the baby for the first time. The infant's eyes fluttered open, deep brown, curious, alive. Alexander felt something inside him crack open, something he hadn't felt since childhood. He looked at Emma, tears stinging his eyes. He's perfect, he said, his voice breaking. He's ours, she murmured. The word ours hung in the air like a promise. For a moment, nothing else existed. Not the scandal, not the headlines, not the hospital's mistakes or the chaos of fate. There was only the quiet rhythm of new life, the soft sound of breathing, and the shared understanding that every wrong turn, every painful moment had somehow led to this. As the hours passed, the hospital settled into calm. Snow continued to fall outside, coating the world in white. Emma dozed lightly while Alexander sat beside her, the baby cradled against his chest. He watched the child's small fingers curl and uncurl, marveled at how something so fragile could feel so powerful. For years he had built walls around himself, high, polished walls made of ambition and control. But this child, this accidental miracle, had torn those walls down without effort. When Emma stirred awake, her voice was soft. "You're still here. I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "You say that now, but things will get complicated. There's still the world out there, the attention, the pressure. You can't protect us from everything." "I don't want to protect you from everything," he said, leaning closer. "I just want to face it with you. Both of you." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, then sighed. "Do you remember what I told you months ago? That you can't control everything?" He nodded. "You finally learned," she said softly. He chuckled, low and warm. "Maybe the hard way." Silence settled again, but it was peaceful now. The baby stirred and Emma reached out, her fingers brushing Alexander's hand. Their eyes met, and in that quiet moment, without ceremony or confession, something passed between them. An understanding that love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it grows quietly in the wreckage of everything else. Weeks turned into months. The world moved on as it always does. The hospital scandal became a documentary footnote, then a cautionary case study. Emma returned to her work, but her art had changed. Her designs carried emotion now, raw, alive, full of light. Her online portfolio grew, clients flocked to her, and soon her name was no longer whispered in scandal but spoken in admiration. She called her new collection the Second Beginning. Each design was inspired by rebirth, a flower blooming through concrete, a city reflected in raindrops, a mother holding a child beneath storm clouds. The world saw beauty, only she and Alexander knew the story behind it. Alexander, too, had changed. The once untouchable billionaire had begun to slow down. He delegated more, smiled more, listened more. The ruthless precision that had built his empire was still there, but it was tempered by something gentler. When he walked into meetings now, he carried a small silver locket in his pocket, a tiny photo of Emma and their son, a reminder of what mattered beyond the boardroom. They lived separately for a while, not because of distance, but because they both understood that healing required space. Yet they saw each other often, walks in the park, dinners filled with laughter, nights spent talking about the strange path that had brought them together. Every time he saw her, Alexander felt the same quiet awe, and every time she looked at him holding their son, Emma felt her walls soften a little more. One spring evening, a year after the birth, the three of them stood on the rooftop of his penthouse, the same one that had once felt cold and sterile, now warm with life. The skyline glowed in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of rain and cherry blossoms. Emma held their son in her arms while Alexander leaned against the railing, watching them. The baby laughed, a bright, pure sound that seemed to echo through the city below. "Do you ever think about how it started?" Emma asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Every day," Alexander said, "and I still don't understand how something so wrong could lead to something so right." She smiled softly. "Maybe it's not about understanding. Maybe it's about accepting that life doesn't always ask for permission." He turned to her then, and for the first time he reached out, not out of obligation or guilt, but out of love. His hand brushed hers, and she didn't pull away. The world below shimmered with light, and for the first time in years both of them felt at peace. The child cooed softly between them, his tiny fingers gripping Alexander's thumb. Emma looked at him, then at the skyline, and whispered, "We're going to be okay." Alexander nodded, his voice steady but full of emotion. "No, Emma, we're going to be extraordinary." As night fell, the city lights bloomed one by one like stars reborn on Earth. Somewhere between the glittering skyline and the heartbeat of a sleeping child, two broken lives had found meaning again. not through perfection, not through control, but through surrender, forgiveness, and the quiet, unstoppable force of love that had begun with a single, unimaginable mistake. And though the world would remember their story as a scandal, they would live it as something else entirely, a miracle born not from science but from grace.